The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Logical Beginnings, Fallacies. Hey everybody, so in a recent video I covered the very beginnings of logical syllogisms and the concepts of validity and soundness. Validity having to do with the structure, soundness having to do with the content. That was to give us a basis to talk about this subject, which is fallacies. If you get nothing else out of anything I say in this video, I'm going to put this right up front. The fact that an argument is fallacious does not mean that the conclusion is false. That is a fallacy called the fallacy. Essentially, you're saying, your argument is fallacious, and the conclusion of your argument is, therefore God exists. And so because your argument is fallacious, we can conclude God doesn't exist. That is a fallacy. That is irrational, illogical. I hate all the other little terms for it. But the thing to remember is that if an argument is fallacious, it means the conclusion cannot be logically assessed. A fallacious argument means the conclusion cannot be logically evaluated, assessed, use whatever language you want. It's like writing a piece of code for a computer. If the code has a bug in it where it can't compile, you get nowhere. It'll never compile. It's not going to run. You don't get to try it out, see if it's doing on the screen what you expected it to do, because it won't compile. It is improperly structured. It'd be exactly the same thing as if you tried to write a mathematical equation, but you wrote the actual equation wrong. If you replace your variables with actual content, you might get the right answer. You might get the wrong answer, because the accuracy of the answer is now independent from the content that you put in there, because the structure is a problem. Logical fallacies come in a variety of different forms and categories. There are websites that you can go to that just list them all off, explain what they are. There's a great website called yourlogicalfallacyis.com, and you can go there and you can hover over stuff and you can say, oh, look, here's one that says special pleading, and it says moving the goalposts or making up exceptions when a claim is shown to be false. A logical fallacy is a flaw in reasoning. There's more there, but there are a number of websites that go through and try to list a bunch of fallacies. You don't have to know them. You don't have to know them all. And it's far more important for you to understand the impact of a fallacy and the different types of fallacies than it is to know everything about all the fallacies. That's the key. If you write code and it's buggy, it just won't compile, so you don't get to test anything. If you write an argument that is fallacious in form, that is invalid in form, we can't assess anything from it. Your conclusion might be true, it might not be true. In the last video, we covered the difference between validity and soundness, with validity being structure and soundness being content. You could also view this in the styles of arguments that are presented. You might be presenting a formal argument, in which case that formal structured argument could have a structural fallacy, or that formal argument might also have an informal fallacy related to the content. You could do validity soundness just like you could do formal informal. But all the formal fallacies that get to the structure of arguments are non sequiturs. All it means is that the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from the premises. That's the key to all non sequiturs. But it still might need you to look at the content, which would go to the soundness of the premises, in order to be able to identify it. An invalid form of an argument just means you have no way of assessing the conclusion. Informal fallacies relate to problems of content and often occur when you're not putting together a syllogism, but arguing kind of informally, like I'm going to present this. You don't have to know logical fallacies by name, and I would recommend that for many of them, even if you know them, You don't use the name of the fallacy in certain circumstances. The prime example that I've used many times is an argument from ignorance. If you tell someone, you just committed an argument from ignorance, for people who don't understand fallacies, they just heard you call them stupid. And they might be, but that's not what you meant. And that's not what the problem is. The problem is that they committed a fallacy. And to say, but that's an argument from ignorance. There are labels for all kinds of fallacies. I'm going to go through and just describe a couple of them. You can find, I guess, on Wikipedia, you can find big, long lists. You can find some at the Urological Fallacy is. But the thing to think about is when we're looking at structural fallacies, something like affirming the consequent. What that means is if we have an argument that says, if A, then B, and we try to go from there and say, B is true, therefore A is true, that is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. The easiest thing to remember when evaluating arguments is, first of all, remove the existing content from it and just look at the form. Put in other things. Put in things that you're comfortable understanding, you're comfortable talking about. All Ford vehicles are cars. Well, that's not true. There's trucks. All cars have four wheels. Well, that's not true. I could take a wheel off. All cars start with four wheels. Well, that's not necessarily true because we've seen three-wheel cars. But if you substitute in things that you have a good understanding of for the content, it'll allow you to assess the arguments a little easier. If you're having difficulty, no matter what the content is, there's a reason why formal logical systems have language and symbols used so that you can write a symbol logic version of the argument that has no content there so that you can see if it's valid in structure. It's kind of like if you're writing code, if it compiles, then your problem is not necessarily in the structure of the language that you're compiling, but in the content of your functions. And so you can look at something like affirming the consequent and say, okay, why is it a fallacy to say if A then B, B therefore A? Okay, if I haven't eaten, then I'm hungry. And then if we said I'm hungry, therefore I haven't eaten, that can feel like it's true. That can feel intuitively as you're just talking. You're like, we know that if I haven't eaten, I'm hungry. And now we know I'm hungry. Therefore I haven't eaten. But that's a fallacy that affirms the consequent. And the demonstration of this is I could be hungry for another reason. I have in fact eaten, but there may be other reasons why I'm hungry, including medication that alters my brain's perception of hunger. Or maybe you just made something that smelled so good that I'm hungry despite the fact that I have eaten. I'm eager to actually eat it. And in addition to something like affirming the consequent, you also have something like denying the antecedent. Whoa, these sound so. This is one of the reasons why I don't worry that much about what they're called. You got post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is Latin for after this, therefore because of this. And we understand that it's a fallacy, but we should just say, just because something happens after something else doesn't mean that the thing that it happened after is its cause. But you've got denying the antecedent, where you say, if A, then B, so same beginning as affirming the consequent, if A, then B, and where affirming the consequent said B, therefore A, this one is not A, therefore B. Let me put it back in regular language. See, you can look at it in the abstract sense of A and B, and that's just too confusing. Draw it out, put a circle on it, but just change it. We'll make A is I haven't eaten, and B, I'm hungry. And so if A then B becomes if I haven't eaten, then I'm hungry. If we were to say, if I have eaten, then I'm not hungry, that would be denying the antecedent. Because it's possible that I have eaten, and yet I'm still hungry. I need something more. I just had a little snack, maybe. And so we understand, colloquially, jumping in and talking about these things, we can spot fallacies without knowing the label, without knowing whether it's a formal fallacy or anything else, by the things that we already know and understand. This is how the work got done in the first place, is to say, okay, let's figure out which structures for arguments are valid. And if we put premises in, can we come up with an example that shows, oh, this isn't true? Can we do a reductio ad absurdum, as I talked about in the validity and soundness video, with the actual structure of the arguments we're talking about? And the answer is yes. Now, at the head of this, I mentioned the fallacy, which is when you conclude that the conclusion of an argument is false because the argument is fallacious. If the conclusion of the argument is Matt has a beard, it doesn't matter how fallacious the argument is, that conclusion's still true. The problem is if the argument's fallacious, you don't have any grounds to say that it's true. You don't have any grounds to say it's false. That argument doesn't stand on its own merits, and the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, so that you can't say whether or not the statement Matt has a beard is true or false based on the argument. You can say it by looking at my face, but why would I want to put people through that? And then there's a number of other fallacies that come in. It's just, I mean, we could probably get down to where they're all part of maybe 4 or 5 or 6 different big categories. But when you get down to brass tacks and you're looking at it, you may say, ooh, this one's just subtly different. And so, for example, you get something like the appeal to nature, sometimes called the naturalistic fallacy. And it takes a bunch of different forms. It may be because, oh, this is what happens in nature, therefore this is the good or right thing to do. Now, where's the fallacy in the structure? If X happens in nature, X should be the model that we follow. Well, we know that's not true. Or at least we don't agree with it, because our natural state is to not have air conditioning. And so if you were to argue that it's natural for us to not have air conditioning, therefore air conditioning is bad, that would be the naturalistic fallacy. Or that, the things that are good for you are natural. A completely different take on, or seemingly completely different take on, the naturalistic fallacy, which is you should, eat natural things, not genetically modified things, not things we've tinkered and tampered with. And yet we know that some of the things we've tinkered and tampered with are in fact better and safer, and that there are plenty of natural things that we shouldn't eat or consume, like arsenic, despite what we might be able to do with it in some context. There are tons of these fallacies, and you can get bogged down in trying to learn all of them. It's much better to start with, to understand the basics of logical arguments, validity and soundness, like we talked about in the last video, and to get the tools down of somebody just presented an argument. How do I start addressing it? I mean, ideally, I would write it down and see if I can put this into a syllogism. Because in conversations on the shows, when people call in and they're asking, they're making their case for something, these aren't logicians. These typically aren't people who even have a written down, formal, structured argument. And for some of the most brilliant minded theists and atheists spend a lot of time formally structuring an argument, but because they're blind to one of their own biases, they can't see the problem with the argument, even though once it's pointed out, they should be able to see. I remember, I've talked about before, the time John Ferrer and I debated, and I thought I had solved the is-ought problem. Pretty arrogant, but in a way I did. And I did it by smuggling in an ought. And John pointed that out in a debate. It took a few seconds of thinking for me to go, oh yeah, I totally did that. Thank you. I don't want to be presenting fallacious arguments, not because the conclusion is necessarily false, but because it doesn't help. It's useless. It's like submitting code that won't compile. It's like submitting a buggy game. It'll keep your QA team in a job for a while, but it's not a game that people can play. It's not a product that people can actually use. There are fallacies that are related to the structure of the argument. They are informal in the formal arguments. These formal fallacies are essentially all non sequiturs. What it means is that the conclusion isn't tied directly to the truth of the premises. So one of the key things you can do is substitute terms. If you can try to learn the shorthand for stuff and write it out there to make sure that you've got valid in structure. Is the argument valid? Does the code compile? Is the argument sound? Does the compiled code run with the intended results? And therein lies a little bit of a problem. Because if you create your argument and you get the expected results, or you write your code and it seems to be running as expected, why on earth should your expectation be the criteria that determines whether or not there's a problem with the code or the argument? Now, it could be that your expectation is correct. We talked before about if you add two even numbers together, you get an even number. You can't add two even numbers and get an odd number. And so we have a reason to expect that if we add two even numbers together, we will get an even number. And the math bears that out. But if our expectation was the opposite, for example, if we said, hey, if you add two odd numbers together, you should get an odd number, you've made an argument via analogy. Add two even numbers together, you get an even number. Add two odd numbers together, you get an odd number, except that second one's not true. So even though the structure is the same, the content is different. And the difference is that there's a difference between odd numbers and even numbers. It's a difficult thing to just jump right in and, it's all logic. I've likened it to math. I've likened it to chess. I've likened it to coding. However you end up thinking about it, just remember that because an argument is fallacious doesn't mean that it's false. And because the conclusion is one that you reject doesn't mean that the premises aren't true. And this is why we allow ourselves to review arguments, and we've come up with ways to look at the structure and separate the structure from the content. I've said before, if the words are getting in the way, if you're having an argument about whether or not there's a God and you just can't get past definitions, stop, back out of that argument and have a different argument or discussion about the nature of evidence, about what sources are we going to rely on. If you're talking with people in a political realm and, for example, they're like, no, the unemployment is now at a 50-year low when you know it to be at a 50-year high, then you should say, hey, what data are we going to use and what sources are we going to use? Are you going to dismiss the sources that I present because they're coming from government officials? Are you going to dismiss the sources that I present because they're not coming from government officials? Are you going to only accept an aggregate model of looking at a variety of different sources? But you may have to have that conversation first. And when you do that, you're basically constructing a sort of syllogism, which you've got them to accept one premise. If you can accept them to accept the second premise, they now have to accept the conclusion if the argument is valid in structure, or they are, in fact, irrational or illogical. I prefer the irrational term to the illogical term, but it's a nitpicky thing. So as you're going out there to your logical fallacy is, or the Wikipedia list of fallacies, just remember that you could spend all day reading through this list of fallacies and saying, ooh, what's a Mott and Bailey fallacy? Ooh, what's an etymological fallacy? Ooh, what's a false equivalence? What's an appeal to consequences? Or argumentum ad baculum. And you could know them. But if you're not familiar with the structure of arguments and why the fallacies matter, it's almost a waste of time. And if you are familiar with the logical structure and why fallacies matter, you'll be able to spot fallacies without ever having a clue what the name of that fallacy is, or if it has a name. It probably has a name, but you'll be able to identify it even if you can't label it. And that's the important part. It's the concepts that matter, not the labels for the concept. Otherwise, we could transcribe this entire video into another language, and every one of the labels is going to shift and change. The labels aren't what matters. This also applies when we're citing our sources. We don't need to appeal to, X person's name or X philosophy's name or label or this fallacy's label. The important part is that we get to where we can actually comprehend that this presentation, this structure, this syllogism is one where true premises lead to true conclusions. I accept that the premises here are true, and therefore I need to accept that the conclusion is true. And if I'm unable to do that, there's either a problem with me or the argument, and we need to dig in on finding out what it is. And the easiest way is to change the terms in there to something we are much more confident in our understanding and our understanding of those subjects. And this is why you can get it all the way down to where it's just language devoid of content or just symbols devoid of content. You can add little pieces of content like everything is A or not A. Well, what does A mean? Okay, everything is alive or not alive. But A could also mean everything is dead or not dead. If it's valid in form and not fallacious, those two are equivalent. Everything is alive and not alive. Everything is dead and not dead. There's nothing about either of those premises that necessarily has a problem that's going to lead to a formal fallacy in an argument. But you don't have to know them by name. It's just better to understand, hey, and when something feels a little wrong, I mean, if you're in a debate and you're having to deal with a clock and an audience, things might be different. But by and large, you don't owe anybody an argument right now. You don't owe anybody an instant reaction to the case that they presented. If there's not time to pause and say, okay, I want to make sure I'm following this. Let's write this down. And we can first, look at the content, get a feel for it. We can remove the content. We can analyze the structure. We can get third parties to look at it, make sure that, neither of us have missed anything. Neither of us are, adding bias or that we haven't committed an equivocation fallacy where I use the same term twice but mean two different things with it, because that changes the nature of the argument. You don't have to know everything about fallacies. You don't have to know them all by name. But understanding the importance and the significance of not committing logical fallacies is the key to making sure that you don't fall for them, you don't spread them, but you're going to. Because we're not perfect and we make mistakes. And so if you identify a fallacy, do what you can to correct it and avoid it in the future. See you next time. Bye-bye.